Five teens would set out for a day of diving in the Gulf of Mexico, and what began as a day of fun would quickly turn harrowing. The teens would battle storms, rough waves, rip currents, and when eventually the rain let up, they thought they were in the clear. However, little did they know, the real danger was lurking just below the surface. Welcome back, mammals. Today we're doing a neat little cryptid deep dive. March 24th, 1962. On this sunny spring Saturday, we find ourselves in the state of Florida. Five boys were planning a little offshore adventure. The five boys were Brian McCleary, 16, Eric Ruley, 16, Warren Sully, 16, Brad Rice, 14, and Larry Bill, 17. The boys were from Fort Walden Beach and were heading west to Fort Pickens in the Pensacola area. The boys were planning to do some skin diving, also called free diving, in an area where there was a battleship. What battleship? Well, about 2 miles off the coast of Fort Pickens lies the remains of the USS Massachusetts, an Indiana-class pre-dreadnought battleship. The area where the ship resides has a depth of about 25 to 30 feet, making it ideal for some free diving. But how were the boys planning to get 2 miles off the coast to see this sunken battleship? With the 7-foot Air Force life raft they brought, of course. Equipped with neat pockets on the sides that kept items safe and dry, the boys also brought oars and a drift anchor, which would reduce the raft's movement in the water when deployed, perfect for anyone who would want to hop out and explore a shipwreck. The boys were also going to bring some snorkeling flippers to help them with their swimming. So they got all their gear together, drove out to Fort Pickens, offloaded the raft and everything in the raft, carried it down to the water, hopped in, some of them pushed it out, and then once they got out a good amount, the boys would then take turns paddling out to sea towards their destination. At this point, the seas were nice and calm, the sky was clear, it was honestly a perfect day to be out there, aside from the water being a little bit cold because it was March. Springtime in Florida can be warmer, however the water temperature is still kind of cold. When they were about halfway to their destination, the winds would pick up, the water would get choppier, and dark clouds would start consuming the blue sky. The boys felt that things were getting a bit too rough for them, so they decided to turn back. However, because of how rough the wind and seas were, they were actually getting pushed further and further from shore. The boys would put in maximum effort to try to get back to shore. Brad and Larry would take the oars and start paddling, while Brian, Eric, and Warren hopped into the cold water and started swimming behind the raft trying to push it toward shore. Unfortunately for the five boys, the seas were too rough, and they weren't really making any progress. So they all got into the raft and held on for dear life as the seas battered them. Then a ray of hope. The boys saw a motorboat heading in towards Pensacola Bay from the channel. So they started frantically waving and yelling and hoping to get the attention of the boat operator. Apparently there was an old woman on the boat that was operating it, and she saw them and she waved back to them. But to the boys' dismay, she continued on her course towards Pensacola Bay. In a last-ditch effort, Brad grabbed his shirt, wrapped it around a spear gun, and fired the spear in the direction of the ship, hoping to get their attention. According to Brian, the spear maybe landed about 50 feet from the boat, but none of the occupants on the boat seemed to notice, and they continued towards port. The boys were once again losing hope at making it back to shore alive, and that's when Brian spotted a buoy in the distance. Brian estimated the buoy to be within a mile of the position of the boys, which was a hell of a lot closer than where the shore was, so they thought maybe they can get over to that buoy, tie their drift anchor to it, and that can keep them tethered until the storm left, and then they could try to get back to shore, without hopefully being dragged out further into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. The boys fought the freezing water, the freezing rain, the rough seas, the high winds, but they finally managed to make it to the buoy, only to encounter a new problem to no one's surprise. The waves lifted the large metal buoy higher than the position that the boys were in the water, and a rip current was now pulling their raft underneath the buoy, so the boys bailed from the raft and struggled to stay afloat, waiting for the raft to then pop back up to the surface of the water. And when it did, they all scrambled and climbed back on, and were hoping that their troubles were over by this point, because so far they keep getting screwed after one bad thing after another. The boys would lay in their raft as the rough seas battered them for an unspecified amount of time. They were exhausted, they were cold, and they were once again losing hope. But just as the weather had turned really nasty really fast, everything suddenly got calm. The water was still, everything was quiet, and a thick fog started to roll in. This posed a new challenge for the boys. They were out in open water, they were still next to the buoy, but because of this thick fog, which according to Brian they couldn't see more than 25 feet in front of them, they didn't know which direction was back towards shore. Despite this challenge, at least the boys could rest a little bit while they waited for the fog to dissipate. Things were looking up. However, as the old story goes, things were about to get worse again. The boys chatted while they waited for the fog to dissipate, when Larry, the oldest of the boys, thought he heard a sound within the fog. Maybe it was a boat in a similar predicament as them. The boys all stopped and listened closely, when suddenly their nostrils were assaulted by the stench of dead fish. While they were getting used to the lingering smell, a large splash could be heard beyond their field of view within the fog. It created large enough wave-like ripples that it reached their raft. Brian estimated the splash to be about 40 feet away from the raft's position. Another splash followed, this time closer. Then, obscured by the fog, a dark silhouette approached. It looked like a large telephone pole with a bulbous head, according to Brian's description. He estimated it to be about 10 feet high from where the water started up to the top of its bulbous head, and as quickly as it appeared, it sank back down into the cold waters. I do have a sketch of this mysterious creature that Brian himself had drawn. The stench of dead fish was ever present and growing stronger, while the boys debated what they just saw. One suggested maybe it was an oarfish. Granted, that doesn't really make sense. They don't exactly hang out of the water like that, 10 feet high. Brian had suggested that maybe they saw a sea monster. The others were hoping he was wrong. The boys sat there in the silence, probably on edge, listening for any more splashing. They were probably praying that whatever they just saw continued along its way and left them alone. At least for the boys, they were in their raft, which might provide them with some kind of protection, probably overall better than being in the cold water. As the boys sat in their raft, scared, a sudden, loud, piercing wail emanated from the fog, and this apparently terrified the boys so much that they put on their diving flippers and bailed from the raft. To them, trying to swim back to shore was better than just sitting there on the raft in the middle of the water, not knowing what direction they'll be potentially attacked from. Think about that. They were so scared that they thought they were better off diving into the water and swimming back to shore themselves. I think that's kind of a crazy thing to do. I would have preferred staying in the raft, but sometimes fear can make you do irrational things. At least the boys had each other as they were swimming along. Oh, and Brian noted some brown, crusty slime in the water once they dove in. Kinda gross. Maybe related to the fish smell, maybe related to what they were seeing. Brian and Eric were just ahead of the other boys as they all swam for their lives. Brian described hearing hissing and splashing somewhere in the fog, noting that whatever creature was around was probably following them. Then, the weather started to turn again. The rain started, the sea got choppy, the wind picked up, but at least the fog started clearing, so I guess that's something. I don't know what's scarier, being able to see the creature coming at you, or not being able to tell what direction it's going to take you. The boys were once again cold, and they were growing tired from their swimming. None of them knew how far they had swam so far, and, well, it was starting to get dark, so they couldn't exactly tell how far from shore they were. As they continued along, Brian and Eric were still ahead of the other three, when a scream was heard. Brian and Eric would hear Warren screaming, yelling that something got Brad, before he suddenly went silent too. Brian panicked, and he started to call out for his three friends, but only Larry emerged from the darkness, approaching Brian and Eric. The boys continued swimming on, pushing themselves through their exhaustion to try and make it back to shore. The boys kept swimming, and they didn't know for how long it had been. Brian was so focused on keeping his exhausted body going that he wasn't paying attention to his surroundings. And when he decided to look back, he saw Eric swimming along with him. However, neither of them could see Larry. Where was Larry? The two would look around, shout for him, and even dive under the water to see if they could see him. But unfortunately, Larry had completely disappeared. Things were looking grim for the boys as they continued. Soon, Eric started suffering really bad cramps to the point where he could no longer swim and he started to sink. Brian swam over to him, put his arm around him, and tried to keep him afloat as they continued back to shore. It should be noted that by this point it was nighttime, and there were no lights in the ocean, so they couldn't exactly see where they were going, except for the occasional lightning flash, which kind of illuminated everything and let them kind of know that they were traveling in the right direction towards shore. But they were still a long ways off. Brian's body was starting to give up on him. Trying to swim himself and support his friend was taking its toll. Brian described how he started to just feel weak, and how he just wanted to give up and let the ocean take him. Then, a flash of lightning, a ray of hope. The two boys saw the Massachusetts, the ship that they originally were going out there to see. To them, this sunken ship could potentially provide them with some kind of shelter or safety until the storm wore out, or maybe until at least morning. They really didn't have much going for them, so it was the best they had. The two would swim towards the sunken ship. As they were getting closer, a large wave would crash on top of them, separating them. When Brian surfaced, he looked around frantically, hoping to see Eric. With another flash of lightning, he saw Eric swimming towards the Massachusetts. He was still alive, so Brian continued after him. As they continued, Brian described seeing another flash of lightning. He saw Eric again, but he wasn't alone. That large telephone pole-looking thing that they saw previously was rising out of the water next to Eric. Brian described seeing eyes and what looked like a mouth opening in that brief flash of lightning. And then this large telephone pole thing came crashing down on Eric. He was probably unaware of what was happening. Brian cried out in anguish, and he just kept swimming and swimming, and somehow, maybe through sheer will, pushed himself until he reached shore. As he was swimming, his feet started to hit sand. He could hear waves crashing. Everything was still pretty dark. He still couldn't really see anything, but he knew he reached shore. He dragged himself out of the water and managed to find shelter in a tower, where he passed out from exhaustion. March 25th, 1962, the following day. In the morning, the sun would wake Brian. He slowly got up and exited the tower. He needed to find help. He got down from the tower and fell into the sand. Unfortunately for him, all the strain he put on his body the previous day was still affecting him, and he couldn't really get far. However, he would be found by some boys, who assumed he was one of the boys that was missing. The previous day, the Coast Guard had apparently found the raft that the boys abandoned, and finding out that there were boys out there on the raft, they sent out a search party looking for them, and the news kind of spread in the area pretty fast by the morning. Brian would be airlifted to the Pensacola Navy Base Hospital, where he would be treated for his exhaustion and for exposure to the elements. At the hospital, when Brian managed to regain consciousness and get his strength up, he would be interviewed by a man named McGovern. He was the director of search and rescue at the time. Brian claimed to have told McGovern everything he knew and everything that happened, all the details, including the sea monster part. According to Brian, McGovern believed him, and he said, quote, "The sea has a lot of secrets. There are a lot of things we don't know about. People don't believe these things because they're afraid to." He would later be interviewed by reporters as well, and after a few days' stay in the hospital, he was discharged to his parents. About a week after the event, on March 31st, 1962, a body would wash up on shore. The body would be identified by Brian as being that of Brad Rice. The other three boys, Larry, Warren, and Eric, were never found. Was this tragic event the result of an actual sea monster attack? Let's go over a couple of things. Some of you may have already noticed that I kept saying Brian described and Brian said this, and from what Brian said, and that's because, with him being the only survivor, all this information comes from his testimony. And this information didn't come from news reports on the event. Everything that I could read about the boys going missing and the other boys being presumed dead just talked about how Brian said that him and his friends were really tired with all the swimming and were growing exhausted and they were not having a fun time out in the water. Brian seemingly never mentioned anything about sea monsters to the reporters, like he apparently did to McGovern. It is entirely possible that he chose not to say anything to reporters because he didn't want to look crazy in the news or to the wider public. Or he did tell the reporters and they just saw him as so traumatized that he was just coming up with things to try to rationalize a horrible event. On a side note, I did check weather reports for that day, and while I couldn't find anything about any storms that happened, I did read that the Gulf has a tendency of having sudden storms, and with Florida being the lightning capital of the US, maybe there was stormy weather, maybe there wasn't, maybe there were other factors, I'm not sure. However, so far I'm tending to believe most of the details that Brian gave. I really don't see a reason why he would make up this story. And speaking of the story, how do we know all this? How do we have all these details? Did he tell McGovern everything, and then McGovern published this somewhere? Well, no. Actually, about 3 years after the event, in 1965, Brian had sat down and done an interview with Fate magazine, where he told them everything. Everything he saw, experienced, the sea monster, the whole lot. Which beckons the question of, why would he do this? Why would he tell this story? Well, maybe he just wanted to get it out there. Maybe it had been bothering him for all these years, and he just needed to tell somebody. He didn't really get any money or substantial fame or anything, or any book deals from telling his story, so I don't think he had a financial motive. I don't think he would have made this up. Brian's friends and family would say how the event deeply affected him for the rest of his life. All that trauma and potential survivor's guilt affecting him, I strongly doubt he would make this up. I generally believe that he probably saw something out there, or he thought he saw something out there. If any of you recall my Kelly Hopkinsville Goblin video, you'd know that the Suttons in their farmhouse thought that they were seeing some kind of little gray man that was hovering about and hanging out on the roof, looking through their windows that they shot at multiple times. And it's believed that the Suttons, while actually scared and thinking they see something extraordinary, they were probably really just seeing aggressive owls flying about trying to defend their nearby nest. That's the running theory, but again, the Suttons were terrified of something being there and they were convinced that they were seeing what they were seeing. And Brian may have had a similar experience. To me, it makes sense. Intense fear, high stress, poor visibility. Him and his friends probably thought they were seeing a monster. They were probably generally freaked out, swam for their lives. Exhaustion probably took hold and they started dropping one by one like flies. And if you recall, one of the bodies did wash up on shore, so an autopsy was performed and, well, they found that Brad probably drowned. There was no bite marks on him, there was no blunt force trauma. He most likely got exhausted, wasn't able to continue, and he sank and drowned. It wasn't really a sea monster, it's just exhaustion. All of these kind of, for me at least, start coming together. I think Brian definitely saw something, but it wasn't a monster, and in him and his friends' panic, that's probably what did them in. And somehow Brian managed to survive and make it to shore, probably through sheer will. But then what could have the boys have actually seen? With the Suttons, it's believed it was an owl. What could have possibly been out there in the water with the boys that freaked them out this much? Well, in my research and looking at different animals and reading different forums, I found 2 different Reddit posts that may hold the answer. The Reddit post suggested that maybe the boys saw a whale. I know, bear with me. So apparently the specific whale might have been a North Atlantic right whale, which is present in the Gulf in March, which is when the boys were out there, and apparently they were still a rare sight even in the 1960s. These whales have a tendency to skim feed, where the top of their upper jaw would be hanging out of the water, going across silently as they were sucking in krill and other things, and then it would silently disappear under the water. I have some images that I'll throw up on screen to show you what I'm talking about. Now imagine this in poor visibility, stormy weather, you're already freaked out, high stress, and you see this coming at you. You know, it'll probably scare the crap out of you. And I even have a video of one of these kinds of whales skim feeding and approaching a boat. And just try to picture this in poor visibility, when you're already feeling fear and stress from the day. It would probably really freak you out. Certain parts of the front end of the whale's face, even in low visibility, could potentially look like a bulbous head with eyes present somewhere. These whales could have scarring or patchy areas that could be misidentified as other facial features, maybe a smaller mouth, maybe eyes, that kind of stuff. Unless you get a clear look, you're not really going to know. Rationale kind of exits the building when you're all scared and you can't really see much. A whale can also explain potentially some of the other details Brian mentioned, like the stench of dead fish could have been the whale itself, and the crusty brown slime in the water could have been whale vomit or whale poop. Brian also mentioned briefly seeing the creature rise out of the water and then come down on Eric. It's entirely possible that the whale may have been skim feeding and then it just came down on Eric accidentally, sucking him down, potentially knocking the wind out of him, and it might have been the final straw for him, causing him to drown and die. Honestly, a lot of this makes sense to me. A lot of it seems to fit pretty well with being an explanation, and personally, I'm convinced that a whale was probably responsible. And the high fear and stress, coupled by poor weather conditions and the poor circumstances the boys were in, probably resulted in this whole sea monster story. But I would like to know what you personally think in the comments down below. There you go, the story of the Pensacola sea serpent. A tragedy, no doubt, but probably not from the result of attacking cryptids. Maybe. Probably. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you liked the video. Next one I'm planning to do is going to involve veterans fighting corruption, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, just don't go into the ocean, ever. Like, seriously, we know more about the surface of the moon than the ocean, apparently, so probably a lot of secrets down there, probably a lot of creatures, probably not a place really any of us should be going. Just stick to lakes. They don't have any lake monsters.